The colony of Kestrel 9 woke under a pale desert sky with a wind that carried dust across every roof and every doorway. People moved as they always did at dawn, checking water filters, wiping sand from the solar panels, and making sure the pumps still pulled brine from the deep. They were used to hardship because this was the weakest colony in all the records of the frontier, a place so small and fragile that other worlds laughed at its name when it appeared on charts. They said it was undefended, unarmed, and unworthy of survival. Governor Maya Reyes stood on the balcony of the central block and watched the horizon. She was not looking for sunrise, for the sun was already climbing, but for the faint smudge of shadow that she had feared would come. When she saw it, her heart grew heavy and her hand trembled for a moment before she forced it still. 3 dark forms were sliding across the edge of the sky. She did not call alarms, and she did not speak on the common radio. She only gave one order through a line that ran to the power shed and the water plant in the school basement. She said, "Begin the 7-minute playbook." All across the colony, people moved with quiet speed. Old Dax at the power shed turned a copper wheel to let the green bar climb, not all the way, but just enough to leave room for the surge he knew was coming. At the schoolhouse, Lita gathered her students and led them down into the lower hall, where the walls were thick and the air was cool. She told them they were starting a game of silence and the prize would be sweets if they could stay still. The children nodded and pressed their lips tight as they began to count the stones on the floor one by one. In the west gate, a miner named Havel strapped bags of mirror dust onto the back of a crawler bike and rode out with his partner Sorrel. They did not speak because words were not needed. Above them, the shapes of ships grew clearer, black angles that stretched across the sky like knives. The colony was not built for war. It had one rail driver buried under salt that had not fired in 2 decades and might not even spin. Its walls were built of fused glass bottles and its signal mast leaned at a tilt patched with rope. The people were not soldiers but farmers, miners, teachers, and mothers. Yet they had the playbook, a plan written in the ashes of the last raid when they had lost water and lives. They had studied their desert the way a hunter studies tracks. They learned how wind bent around the ridges, how heat rose and gathered in valleys, how sound carried under the pipes of the water plant. They wrote it all into steps and gave it a name that sounded like a game, but was no game at all. The ships descended and the lead one spoke on the open band. It demanded their tools, their water, and their surrender. The voice laughed and said it was easy prey. Maya did not answer. She walked down from the balcony into the square and placed her hand on the old iron post in the center. It was tied to the hidden mesh under the streets and her touch closed a circuit. Far away, mirrors disguised as broken panels tilted and began to drink the morning sun. Havel and Sorrel rode toward the shallow basin covered in tempered glass sheets, dust trailing behind them like careless tracks. When they reached the far edge, they slowed and turned so the enemy skiffs could see them and give chase. They looked clumsy on purpose, letting the ships believe they were frightened colonists running without thought. The skiffs darted after, them with engines screaming. In the power shed, Dax listened to the hum of the transformers. He opened a vent so the heat could flow into ducts buried under the town. Those ducts were joined to the old terraforming towers. Towers, everyone thought, were dead. When he threw a small switch, they awoke like sleepers long trained for this moment. They breathed in hot air and pushed out cool, changing the wind across Main Street. Dust lifted into the air and spread like a curtain. In that haze, the invaders lost their clear view of the square. On the glass field, the first skiff crossed the seam and its fins could not find grip. It slid sideways, fighting against nothing, and the second skiff crashed into it. They spun together like toys tossed in a basin while the riders cursed and fired shots into the air that only struck the dust. The leadership fired a beam that cracked a storage shed, turning it into rubble. The blast lit the square for a moment and Maya felt pain strike her chest because that sheet had belonged to her cousin, who kept spare filters and a framed picture of his mother there. She swallowed the grief and kept her eyes on the iron post. 2 minutes had passed since she gave the order. The raiders thought they were frightening a weak colony, but the colony was riding the rhythm of a trap. The children stayed silent in the hall, counting stones as Lita whispered numbers. The power climbed higher. The playbook moved on its path, and the sky seemed to press lower as the third minute began to turn. Life in Kestrel 9 always looked quiet from the outside. Anyone who visited saw miners walking home with dust in their hair, farmers checking algae pools, children learning to read old books in a one-room schoolhouse, and a baker pulling bread made of seaweed oil and algae flour from her clay oven. Outsiders thought it was weakness, a place without teeth or claws. But inside the colony, every job was tied to survival. The miners knew more about stone and heat than most engineers. The farmers could keep crops alive with half the water other worlds needed. The teachers had drills not for words but for silence and stillness. The baker knew how long her oven could stay hot before the metal warped, and that number was written into the playbook as a signal for the heat cycle. All of them knew their role. It was why when the raiders came, nobody screamed and nobody begged. They moved with the same calm they used each day when the desert tried to kill them in smaller ways. The enemy ships circled overhead, frustrated that their first passes had not broken the people. The skiffs that chased Havel and Sorrel still spun across the glass basin, their engines whining as they tried to find purchase. Sorrel crouched low and adjusted the wrist transmitter. The bar on the small screen ticked higher. 3 minutes. She whispered the time under her breath, not as a command but as a prayer. Havel spread more mirror dust with a sweep of his hand, so the air thickened in shimmer and the line between earth and sky blurred even more. They could feel the ships watching, scanning, growing impatient. That was the design. The playbook was written not to fight the enemy head-on, but to stretch their temper, to lead them into anger where they made mistakes. In the square, Maya still stood at the iron post. Around her, people worked as if they were only tending to chores. A woman walked with a basket that seemed to hold cloth, but inside was a coil of wire she laid near the mesh. A man carried jars that rattled like food, but inside was slurry from the smelters that he poured into ducts. Every act was ordinary in shape but deadly in intent. Dax at the power shed wiped sweat from his brow and closed another vent to build the pressure under the streets. He knew when the time came the ground itself would move. He thought of his father who had died in the first raid years ago, and he tightened the wheel one more turn. The hum in the wires deepened until he felt it in his bones. The raiders did not understand silence. They expected screams, confusion, or at least desperate chatter on open channels. When all they heard was wind and the faint hiss of sand, they grew uneasy. The lead ship dropped lower and released a burst of jamming. All radios in the colony went dead. For a heartbeat, it seemed they were cut from one another, but then small lamps along rooftops blinked alive. The signal mesh under the square carried, pulses that lit them in lines one after another, until the whole town looked like a field of fireflies. Lita touched a lamp in the shelter, and the lamp answered with its blink that ran across the ridge to the salt flats. The colony did not need words anymore. It only needed the beat of time, and the steps of the playbook in the shelter children counted stones, while Lita checked her wrist for the rhythm of the signal. She could hear the enemy's engines above, roaring like storms, but she kept her voice even. She told the children the story of the first settlers, how they planted seeds in brine and believed the desert could be made green, and how they built walls from glass bottles because glass was all they had. The children listened with wide eyes, and still they stayed quiet. Each number was part of the story, and each breath was part of the plan. Outside, Wren at the water plant stood by the pressure valve with her hand resting on the steel. She felt the rising pulse inside the pipe and timed her breathing to it. When it reached its peak, she would release it, and the sudden burst of steam would change the air across the north field. It was written in the playbook that way, because even the sigh of steam could matter when the traps closed. 4 minutes passed, and the raiders decided to test the colony's strength again. A beam of plasma struck another building at the edge of the town. Wood and glass cracked and fire leapt high. People flinched, for it was their neighbor's home, but they did not scatter. 2 men stepped forward and used sand to smother the fire. A third man carried out a picture frame, handing it to the woman who had lived there. She held it to her chest but did not weep. Maya saw it all and felt the ache of grief, but she did not move from her place. She knew the raiders were watching, waiting for fear. She gave them nothing. Instead, she raised her chin and locked her eyes on the sky. Daring them to come lower, Sorrel and Havel crouched on the far side of the basin as the skiffs finally slowed. One of the raiders fired a shot in rage, striking the glass and sending cracks in jagged lines across the surface. The cracks spread like spiderwebs, and the weight of the skiffs broke the panels. Engines whined as they fell into the shallow pit beneath. Dust covered them, hiding their shame. Sorrel tapped her transmitter again. The bar climbed to 5. She whispered the number. Havel smiled grimly. The plan was working. Above them, the largest ship turned, its engines glowing brighter as it prepared to descend and crush the colony with sheer force. It believed the town weak. It did not know that the desert itself had been turned into a weapon, waiting for one more minute to strike. The people of Kestrel 9 did not shout or raise banners. They held their places, each person a piece of the same machine. Miners at the smelters watched their gauges. Farmers guided their crawler rigs into shadowed gullies. Dax at the shed let his hand hover over the final switch. Wren closed her eyes and counted heartbeats against the rising pressure of the valve. Maya whispered the word 6 into the iron post, and the word ran like fire through the hidden mesh. The playbook was almost complete. The enemy thought it was pressing its boot down on weak ground, but it was pressing on a trigger it could not see. The 6th minute of the playbook began with the sound of engines roaring across the desert sky. The enemy flagship lowered itself, above Kestrel 9, its shadow stretching across the square and the ridges beyond. The colonists felt the vibration under their feet as the ship pressed closer, but they did not scatter. They had lived with the desert's weight all their lives, and the ship was only another storm to endure. Governor Maya Reyes kept her hand on the iron post, feeling the current hum through the buried mesh, and her eyes stayed fixed on the black shape above. She knew what was coming, and she knew the people trusted her silence. It was not the silence of fear, but the silence of timing. Every breath measured, every step linked to the rhythm of the plan. Havel and Sorrel crouched low on the far side of the broken glass basin. The skiffs that had chased them were half buried in dust, their engines choking as raiders tried to climb free. The riders fired wildly, but the heat shimmer bent their aim and their shots vanished into haze. Havel pressed his palm against the ground and felt it trembling with the pulse of power being drawn into the buried ducts. He knew the smelters had released their slag, and that heat was moving beneath the surface. Sorrel kept her eyes on the wrist transmitter, watching the bar climb. 6 minutes, she whispered, and the word tasted like iron in her mouth. Both of them knew what the 7th minute would bring, and both of them waited with steady breath in the power shed. Old Dax leaned against the humming wall of machinery. Sweat poured down his face, but his hand never left the copper wheel. The green bar on his gauge was kissing the red line now, the wires thrumming like strings under tension. He thought of his father, who had fallen to raiders years ago, and he felt no fear, only a grim patience. This was the moment his father had dreamed of when the playbook was first written. Dax touched the final switch but did not press it yet. He would wait for the signal, because every second counted. The colony's strength was not in its machines but in its patience, the way each person trusted the others to hold the line until the time was right. At the water plant, Wren stood by the steel valve with her hand pressed against its vibrating surface. She felt the pressure building, a living heartbeat inside the pipe. The children in the shelter were still counting stones, their voices soft and steady as Lita guided them, her own voice never trembling. Above, the enemy flagship opened its bays and released drones that darted down like insects. They scattered across the rooftops, sending bursts of static as they jammed any lingering signals. But the lamps on the roofs blinked back, lines of light stretching from one corner of the colony to the next, speaking without words. The enemy thought it had cut the town's voice, but the town had never needed one voice. It had many, and all were beating in unison now. Maya stood in the square and raised her eyes to the sky as the flagship descended lower still. The engines burned so bright the air wavered with heat, and the roar pressed against her chest, but she did not move. Around her, people held their positions, some with baskets, some with tools, some with nothing but empty hands. They did not look like soldiers, yet each one was part of the same trap. The raiders mocked them once as weak and defenseless, but weakness had taught them to bend the desert into a weapon sharper than steel. Maya's lips parted and she spoke a single word into the iron post. 7 in that instant, the colony moved as one. Ren spun the valve at the water plant and steam burst from the pipes with a scream that rolled across the north field. The smelters released their built-up heat, flooding the buried loop with energy that turned the ground into a slow wave of rising force. Dax slammed the final switch and the power grid flipped, sending white light surging through the mesh under the square. The terraforming towers groaned and exhaled, whipping the dust into a wall that wrapped around the colony. The mirrors tilted, catching the sunlight and focusing it into beams that cut through the haze like blades of fire. Havel and Sorrel lit their engines and sped away from the basin as the buried glass panels collapsed fully, dragging the skiffs into a pit they could not escape. They did not need to look back, for the roar of enemy curses was enough. The flagship above, blinded by dust and heat shimmer, dropped lower to strike what it thought was a crumbling settlement. Its scanners read false echoes, chasing the light drones that darted through the storm like phantom fighters. Every system the colony had hidden came alive, not as weapons, but as illusions and traps. The flagship moved into the exact position the playbook had predicted years ago. The rail driver beneath the salt flats began to wake. For 2 decades it had rested silent, its barrel rusting and its coils asleep. But deep inside it still remembered its purpose. Power surged through its veins now, drawn from every panel, every duct, every smelter. The ground shuddered as magnets spun and the old machine roared back to life. The people of Kestrel 9 felt the vibration under their feet and knew what it meant. The driver was ready. Maya closed her eyes for one breath, then opened them again. She whispered the word, fire, though no sound carried beyond the post. The rail driver answered with thunder. It did not launch a simple slug, but a storm of shaped sand and iron, a weapon designed by miners who knew how to make the desert itself strike like a fist. The blast tore upward through the dust wall and slammed into the belly of the flagship. Metal screamed and fire blossomed as the ship split open, its engines faltering, its pride broken. Raiders screamed over open channels, panic flooding their voices. In the space of one heartbeat, the weakest colony in the galaxy had drawn blood from a predator. The 7 minutes were over. The world would never see Kestrel 9 the same way again. The desert sky turned red with the burning fragments of the enemy flagship as it staggered above Kestrel 9. The rail driver's strike had ripped open its belly, and fire spilled from the wound. For a moment the colonists thought it might fall directly upon them, but the great ship lurched sideways and fought to stay aloft. Smaller raider craft panicked, breaking formation, some fleeing into the upper sky while others dove low as if to salvage pride by striking helpless targets. But nothing in Kestrel 9 was helpless anymore. The playbook had been written for this moment, and though the great strike was done, the plan was not finished. Governor Maya Reyes kept her hand on the iron post, feeling the hum settle as the driver cooled, and she watched the chaos unfold with eyes that did not blink. She whispered, "Hold," and the people obeyed. They did not cheer yet. They did not celebrate. Victory was not secure until the last raider had gone. Old Dax in the power shed adjusted the copper wheel again and let the bar fall a notch. The wires trembled but no longer screamed with strain. He knew the old driver had spent its fury and it would take long hours before it could be ready again. That did not matter. The strike had done its work. Now it was the colony's turn to make sure the enemy bled with every breath. Dax opened the vent wide and the pressure in the ducts shifted. Steam rolled through the streets and wrapped the buildings in haze. He smiled through his sweat, thinking of his father and how he had once said the desert itself would fight beside them if only they learned to listen. At the water plant, Ren released another valve, guiding the steam toward the northern ridge where raider drones had landed to scan for targets. The sudden burst of hot air blinded their sensors and their wings beat uselessly against the swirl. Farmers waiting in crawler rigs triggered their improvised reflectors, polished sheets of metal that caught the sun and threw blinding light into the eyes of the enemy. The drones spun, colliding with one another until they tumbled down into the sand where waiting hands smashed them with hammers and shovels. Every villager had become a soldier, and every tool was now a weapon hovel, and Sorrel sped across the dunes on their bikes, mirror dust still trailing behind them. They rode toward the canyon mouth where the ground narrowed into a natural funnel. Behind them, 3 raider skiffs gave chase, furious that their comrades had been trapped in the glass basin. Havel guided his bike over ridges and dips with the ease of a man who had grown up on this land, and Sorrel followed close. At the canyon entrance, they split apart, darting to either side. The skiffs followed straight, roaring into the narrow gap, but they did not see the nets strung between the walls. Cables woven from steel and fiber snapped tight and wrapped around the crafts. Engines screamed, metal twisted, and in moments the skiffs were tangled and broken. Havel circled back and raised his hand to Sorrel. She grinned through the dust and lifted her wrist to show the bar climbing to 8. They had already gone beyond the 7 minutes, but the fight was not done, and every second after was theirs to shape. In the shelter, Lita hushed the children and told them to keep counting. Their small voices blended with the rumble outside. She felt the building shiver as another blast struck a nearby ridge, but she did not flinch. She knew the colony was holding. She knew Maya's voice would carry when it was safe, and until then her job was to keep the young steady. She told them another story, of how settlers once planted trees that never grew but still believed the desert could be made to bloom. She said that belief was stronger than guns, and the children nodded even as they clutched stones tight in their hands. Someday they would tell this story to others, she thought, and they would remember how silence saved them. Maya raised her eyes to the sky once more. The flagship was wounded but not yet destroyed. It drifted above, leaking fire, and its guns still spat bolts of light in rage. One struck near the edge of town and tore open a line of homes. Flames climbed high. Men and women rushed with buckets and shovels of sand. Maya felt her chest ache at the sight of loss, but she also saw how the people did not falter. They moved with rhythm, as if the fire itself was part of the playbook. She whispered steady into the iron post. Lamps blinked across rooftops, carrying her message to every corner. No one would run. No one would break. The colony had already bled, but it would not bow above. The raiders began to realize their prey was no prey at all. They saw their skiffs trapped, their drones shattered, their flagship burning. Panic spread among them like fire in dry grass. Some fled, engines shrieking as they clawed for the safety of orbit. Others turned reckless, diving down in blind fury. It was their mistake. The terraforming towers breathed again, stirring a storm of dust so thick it swallowed the reckless pilots. They lost sight of ground and horizon, and one after another they smashed into ridges or slammed into the desert floor. The colony had not fired at them, yet the desert itself claimed them as victims. When the storm cleared, the sky was no longer full of enemy craft. The flagship limped away, spitting smoke, leaving behind wreckage and silence. Maya lifted her hand from the iron post for the first time in 7 minutes and more. Her voice carried across the square as she said, "It is done." The people straightened and looked to the sky where fire still burned, and they felt pride rise in their chests. They had been called weak, but in 7 minutes they had broken an enemy fleet. Now the desert wind carried their defiance into the heavens, and none who heard would ever laugh at Kestrel 9 again. The smoke of the retreating flagship still hung in the air when the people of Kestrel 9 began to take account of what had been lost and what still stood. Houses were cracked, walls were scorched, and the square smelled of ash. But the colony was alive. For years they had been named the weakest settlement. Yet now they had forced a raider fleet into flight in less than the time it took for the sun to climb above the ridges. Maya Rhea stood in the center of the square, her hand still tingling from the iron post, and she looked at the faces of her people. They were tired and dust-covered, yet their eyes shone with a fire no outsider would ever mistake for weakness again. She wanted to give them words of triumph, but she knew the battle was not finished. Raiders who ran in panic often returned when anger cooled, and the wounded flagship might call for reinforcements. The playbook had worked, but the desert had more to give. If needed, old Dax checked his gauges in the power shed and let the lines fall back into balance. The rail driver had cooled to silence once more, its coils drained, but he placed a hand on the metal wall and whispered thanks. It had done what was asked, and perhaps it would do so again if given days to heal. Until then, the colony must fight with what remained. He stepped out into the open air and saw the smoke curling from the ruins of the shed that had been struck earlier. Men and women were already hauling stone to patch it, their faces grim but steady. Dax walked past them and lifted his head to the sky. He knew the desert would test them again, and he was ready. Wren at the water plant turned the valve closed and wiped her hands on her tunic. Steam still hissed from the pipes and drifted over the fields where algae pools bubbled. She looked toward the north ridge and saw the broken shells of drones littered like dead beetles. Farmers were already collecting the wrecks, salvaging metal, and wiring that would serve the colony for years. Wren smiled faintly, for even in war nothing was wasted here. Every piece of the enemy would become part of their strength. She thought of her brother who had fallen in the first raid long ago, and she felt peace that his death had not been in vain. The colony had proved it would never be prey again. Havel and Sorrel rode back from the canyon, their bikes streaked with dust. They carried the news of the skiffs broken in the nets and the raiders buried under rubble. When they reached the square, they dismounted and faced Maya. Sorrel lifted her wrist to show the transmitter still ticking, the bar frozen at 8. The playbook had been meant for 7 minutes, but they had gone beyond, and still the enemy had been held. Maya nodded, pride soft in her eyes, but she did not speak of victory yet. Instead, she asked how many of their own had fallen. Havel bowed his head and named 3. A smelter worker, a farmer, and a child who had been struck by flying debris. The square grew quiet as their names passed through the air. The colony did not cheer, for grief was part of their strength too. They stood in silence to honor the dead before they lifted their heads again. The children emerged from the shelter led by Lita. Their faces were pale, but their eyes were bright. They had held their silence, they had counted their stones, and they had learned what it meant to stand as one. Lita guided them into the square, where families embraced them with relief. One child, the smallest, held up a stone and told Maya he had reached 100 before the noise stopped. Maya knelt and placed her hand over his, telling him the stone was proof that Kestrel 9 was stronger than anyone believed. The child nodded, and his smile spread to the others until the square glowed with pride as well as grief. Above the colony, the sky was clearer now, but the people knew it was not safe. The flagship limped away, trailing fire, but it was still alive. Maya raised her voice so all could hear. She said the enemy will return, perhaps in hours or perhaps in days, and when they do, we must be ready. She ordered scouts to the ridges, farmers to prepare more reflectors, and miners to dig fresh trenches. The playbook had saved them once, but now they must write new steps born from the blood of this day. The people nodded without hesitation. They had tasted strength, and they would not let it fade. That night the desert was lit by the glow of fires being doused and wreckage being gathered. Families rebuilt their homes with what remained. Miners hauled iron plates from storage to strengthen walls. Farmers strung new nets across gullies. Every hand worked until stars filled the sky. Maya walked among them, speaking quietly to each group, offering not promises but presence. When she reached the edge of the town, she looked out toward the horizon where the enemy had fled. She did not know when they would return, but she knew one truth as solid as stone. The colony that had once been called the weakest had shown a strength no fleet could erase. The desert had been their ally, the playbook their shield, but it was the people themselves who had carried them through. When the enemy came again, Kestrel 9 would be waiting. The stars over Kestrel 9 burned sharp and cold when the second night fell after the battle. The colony was quiet but not asleep. Watchfires glowed on the ridges where scouts kept eyes on the horizon. Families huddled close in repaired shelters, while miners and farmers worked side by side to fortify walls with scavenged plates of iron. The air carried the faint tang of metal and ash. Everyone knew the raiders had not been defeated completely. The flagship had limped away, but such a ship did not wander alone. It would send a call for vengeance, and vengeance would come. The colony was no longer afraid, yet the silence was heavy with waiting. Governor Maya Reyes walked through the narrow streets with her coat pulled tight against the wind, speaking to each watch team, reminding them the desert was still theirs. She felt the weight of every loss, but she carried herself straight. People needed to see calm in her eyes because calm was strength. Old Dax sat in the power shed with the driver coil still cooling beneath the salt flats. He ran his hand across the worn gauges, knowing the weapon could not be fired again so soon. The old machine had given everything, and it would take long days to restore its strength. He muttered that they would not rely on one weapon again. The colony itself was the true weapon now, and every path, every tower, every vent would be sharpened. He began to sketch on scraps of paper by lantern light, drawing new circuits, ways to reroute heat faster, ways to push more pressure through the ducts. He was no soldier, but his mind worked like steel, bending and forging new plans from old scars. Ren at the water plant worked with a crew of farmers to expand the steam lines. They laid new pipes across the North Ridge, hammering them into the rock with bare hands and grit. Her arms ached, but she pushed harder because she knew water was life and water could also be a weapon. When the next fleet came, the colony would turn the desert air itself into their ally. She remembered her brother's face and felt each strike of the hammer as a promise to him. The farmers around her shared the same look of fire. They had planted seeds in brine, and now they planted resolve in steel. Havel and Sorrel rode out again, on their bikes, scouting the dunes where wreckage still smoldered. They found pieces of skiffs twisted and broken, half buried in sand. From each ruin, they salvaged what they could: plasma coils, engine cores, shards of armor. These were carried back to the colony, not as trophies but as tools. The raiders had brought war, and war would now feed the colony's strength. Sorrel spoke little, but her eyes were sharp, always scanning the horizon. Havel felt pride in her silence. They both knew this desert was theirs, and no raider could take it without bleeding for it. Inside the schoolhouse, Lita gathered the children, once more. They had seen fire and wreckage, they had counted stones in silence, and now they asked questions about death. She answered as gently as she could, telling them that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to keep standing. She told them their parents had stood so they could live, and one day they would stand too. The children listened with wide eyes and small hands clutching each other's sleeves. Someday, Lita thought, these children would carry the playbook in their bones, even if no one ever spoke of it again. They would know the desert's rhythm, they would know patience, and they would know that even the weakest place could rise when pressed. As the colony worked, the horizon grew restless. Scouts on the ridges saw flares of light in the sky, distant but moving closer. The flagship had kept its promise. Reinforcements were coming. Maya received the report in the square and closed her eyes for a long breath. She felt no fear, only the steady fire of resolve. She called the people together and spoke with a voice that carried through the dust-filled air. She told them the raiders believed Kestrel 9 would bow twice, that they believed fear would take root after the first blow. She told them the raiders did not understand what had grown in the desert. They did not understand that weakness had been burned away, long ago. She lifted her hand and pointed to the sky, saying when they returned, "We show them again what 7 minutes means." The people raised their heads and nodded. No cheers rose, for cheers were wasted breath, but their silence was deeper than fear. It was the silence of a trap being set once more. Miners prepared their smelters, farmers strung their nets, children carried stones to weigh down fresh reflectors. Old Dax tested his circuits again and again. Ren checked the pipes until her hands bled. Havel and Sorrel rode to the ridges to bait the enemy into paths already mapped in their minds. Maya stood in the square, her hand once again resting on the iron post, feeling the hum of the mesh below. She whispered, "Hold." The desert listened, the people listened, and the stars above bore witness as Kestrel 9 prepared for the storm that was coming. The horizon of Kestrel 9 lit with fire when the second fleet arrived. Dozens of ships spread across the night sky, their engines carving bright scars against the stars. The wounded flagship had called for vengeance, and vengeance had come in numbers greater than before. Raiders believed they would crush the colony with sheer weight, but the people of Kestrel 9 stood ready. They had written new steps to the playbook, steps born from the blood and dust of the first battle. Governor Maya Reyes stood at the center of the square with her hand on the iron post once again. Her eyes never left the sky as the swarm of ships descended. She whispered steady, and the lamps blinked across rooftops, carrying the word to every soul. The desert was listening too. And the desert would answer. On the ridges, Havel and Sorrel waited with their bikes, engines idling low. The plan was to draw the first wave toward the canyon, where nets and charges were hidden beneath the sand. They felt the tremble of the ground as the ships roared closer. Sorrel tapped her wrist transmitter and nodded. The bar was climbing. They sped forward, leaving trails of dust that shimmered in the rising heat. Raiders spotted them and sent skiffs in pursuit, confident that two riders could not stand against the might of their fleet. They did not know the land beneath their engines was a map of traps. As Havel and Sorrel darted into the canyon mouth, the skiffs followed without hesitation. When the charges beneath the sand ignited, fire and rock surged upward, swallowing the pursuers. The two riders burst out of the canyon alive while wreckage burned behind them. In the power shed, old Dax guided the circuits with trembling hands. The rail driver was still weak, not ready to fire again, but he had built a new path for the current, one that would spread power through the colony like veins carrying blood. Every tower, every duct, every mirror would glow brighter than before. He whispered to the coils, thanking them, then threw the switch. A low hum rose through the ground as the mesh beneath the square came alive once more. The desert itself seemed to shiver as if breathing with the colony. Wren at the water plant shouted for her crew to release the valves. Steam burst into the air in thick white clouds, rolling across the north fields and curling around the ridges. The raiders fired blindly into the haze, their shots striking empty ground. Farmers swung their reflectors into position, casting beams of sunlight even in the night by catching the glare of burning wreckage and bouncing it back. Blinding flashes dazzled the enemy pilots, and more skiffs collided in panic. The colony had turned night itself into a weapon, bending smoke and flame as they bent the desert wind. Lita led the children back into the shelter, guiding them with calm words. She told them to count again, not stones this time, but heartbeats. Each heartbeat was a promise that the colony was still alive. The children pressed close and obeyed, their small voices steady. Outside, the storm of battle raged, but inside the shelter, hope grew stronger. They were learning that courage was not only the work of adults. Courage lived in their silence, in their waiting, in the trust that their people would stand the enemy. Flagship, repaired enough to fight, pushed through the haze and bore down on the square. Its guns glowed hot as it prepared to erase the colony once and for all. Maya felt the heat of its engines wash across her face, but she did not step back. She pressed both hands to the iron post and spoke the final word of the playbook. Now. Across the colony, every trap released in one great breath. Nets strung across gullies snapped tight and pulled ships into the earth. Towers exhaled storms of sand that cut engines. Steam vents screamed and blinded sensors. Drones that had been hidden among rooftops rose and struck like swarms of insects, each one a tool remade from enemy wreckage. The fleet staggered as if the desert itself had come alive to strike them down. Then the rail driver gave a final gift. Though its coils were weak, it managed one last cough of fury. Not a full shot, but enough to hurl a storm of iron shards upward. The blast ripped through the flagship's wounded frame. Fire split it apart and it fell in two burning halves onto the dunes beyond the colony. The ground shook, the sky glowed red, and silence followed. One by one, the remaining ships turned tail and fled into the black, leaving wreckage and shame behind. When the last engine faded from the sky, the people of Kestrel 9 stepped from their shelters and lifted their eyes. They were bruised and weary, but they were unbroken. Families embraced. Farmers dropped their tools and held one another. Children lifted their counted stones into the air as if to show proof of survival. Maya stood in the square with dust on her face and fire in her eyes. She looked to her people and spoke the truth they all knew. We were called the weakest, yet, in 7 minutes and more, we showed the galaxy our strength. Let them remember this night. Let them remember that even the smallest colony can break a fleet. The desert wind carried her words across the ridges, and the people of Kestrel 9 answered not with shouts, but with silence deeper than any cheer. It was the silence of unity, the silence of victory. The playbook had saved them again, but it was their spirit that had written it. They had endured. They had won. The legend of Kestrel 9 was born, and it would spread across the stars like fire carried by the wind. The sun rose over Kestrel 9, painting the dunes with gold and fire, and the colony stood together as one unbroken force. The wreckage of the raiders lay scattered across the fields and ridges, smoking and silent, a testament to what a people united could achieve. Maya walked through the streets, her boots sinking into warm sand, and she saw the faces of those who had fought and survived. Every scar, every bruise, every burned coat was a mark of their courage, and every eye reflected the pride that no enemy could erase. Children ran ahead, laughing and chasing the shadows of dust devils, learning in their play the strength of their home and the power of their people. Havel and Sorrel rode past with their bikes, engines quiet now, their smiles wide, knowing that the traps and clever plans had worked perfectly and that the desert itself had been their ally. Old Dak sat on the edge of the power tower, hands still trembling from guiding the currents but eyes bright with satisfaction, knowing that every spark he had touched had helped save a world from fire. Wren and her crew wandered through the fields, checking water valves and irrigation channels, keeping the lifeblood of the colony flowing and realizing that even after the battle, their work mattered as much as any shot fired or net released. Lita gathered the children in the center square once more, telling them stories not of fear but of bravery. And the children repeated the tales, their voices steady and proud, carrying lessons of resilience that would shape every heartbeat in the colony for generations. The desert wind whispered through the ridges and across the sands, carrying a quiet applause that seemed almost alive, as if the land itself celebrated the victory alongside its people. Ships from distant allies who had watched from the edges of the system began to appear on the horizon, drawn by the legends that had already begun to spread through the galaxy, drawn by the story of a weak colony that had become unstoppable in moments when courage met unity. The colonists looked up and saw that help would come if needed, but for now they were enough for themselves, strong in spirit, wise in strategy, and fearless in heart. Families reunited, friends embraced, and strangers who had fought side by side felt the invisible bond of survival and triumph. The playbook lay in its central vault, worn but honored, and everyone knew that it was not only the plans or machines that had saved them, but the will of the people, the refusal to bow to those who underestimated them, the belief that even the smallest and weakest could rise above impossible odds. In the quiet moments after the battle, when no engines roared and no fire lit the sky, the people of Kestrel 9 stood together and felt something larger than themselves, a power that no fleet, no weapon, and no fear could ever break. And in that moment, beneath the rising sun and above the endless desert, the galaxy learned a lesson that would echo through every corner of space. Underestimate the humans at your own peril. Kestrel 9 would live, it would grow, and it would be remembered forever as the colony that turned 7 minutes into a legend. The end.